Speaking about the phrase that you used, making root causing or the recausing on the recalls, I think that's a good way to put it. And I think that speaking about the intensiveness of the changes within production calls for further validation, which again calls for further failures in production. And how is it? You just mentioned briefly that risk assessment, quality by design. Is this just new concepts that are taking into use to ensure better validation, but in the end, actually, you come up with a validation that is actually perhaps even poorer?
Yeah, these concepts, like I said, I'm not against them, but let me just give you examples. For example, risk assessment. It's a good program. You should have a risk assessment program. But what I find is that companies are not properly applying the risk assessment. You're supposed to do risk assessment to identify areas of risk, which is the same as PA, right? Preventive action. To identify what could be a risk so that you can take preventive actions to prevent from happening. But what I find in industry is that a lot of companies are using risk assessment, or I always say they're actually abusing risk assessment. They're doing risk assessment to identify areas of, quote, low risk so that they don't have to do anything, so that they can cut corners, okay? So they use risk assessment and evaluate machine, and they say, well, this function is low risk, so we don't have to qualify this function. No, if you have a machine, and if you have a functional specification for that machine, then you have to show that you are compliant to the functional spec, regardless of whether that function is high risk or low risk. In fact, what I say to them is, if it is low risk, then why did you put it as part of your spec, right? But the compliance requirement is, you make it part of your spec, you're going to have to qualify it. So I find that we are not properly applying the risk assessment program. The QBD, quality by design, that's been around for quite a while now. It is more of a regulatory thing. It did not start out as a GMP, it's still not a GMP requirement. And quality by design was basically that if you can send us data, us, the FDA, data from your development phase to show us how you come up with this process, how you come up with these ranges, and you have done a lot of studies to support the highs and the lows and so forth, your application has a chance of getting a quicker review. And of course, that's common sense. Okay? Is that a novel GMP requirement? No. That has always been an FDA requirement from the GMP side, going back to 1987, when the FDA issued their process validation guideline, that you have to have development support for your product, for your process, and so forth. And the FDA has intensified that with the revision in 2011, where it is now a requirement, not just nice to have the design. It is now stage 1, okay, process design, which is for R&D, research and development, to test and try and play with all of these different parameters and so forth. So quality by design, definitely it is an important thing, but let's not focus on all the mechanics of that system and all the mechanics of that program. Let's focus on those parts of that program, which is the challenge testing, okay, that are required as part of the GMP compliance, which is stage 1 of process validation. So I just want to clarify, I have nothing against these programs. They're great programs if we apply them properly, if we use them properly. But they could be very damaging when we use them as an excuse to violate GMP compliance.
What we've been seeing as a trend, speaking about quality by design, you do see some pharma clients making use of design qualification, design reviews, which is kind of validating that the design is correct, that the design meets the user requirements. Do you have any experience working with design qualification? Because some of these companies have taken in design qualification as a formal qualification activity.
Design qualification, you mentioned design review. I cannot touch that because that's medical devices, okay? And that's not my area, okay? On design review, design verification, and design validation, those are medical device GMP requirements. But in terms of design qualification, DQ, as we commonly call it, that is, of course, a GMP requirement for the piece of equipment. So we do expect a company to do a design qualification, a DQ. But the example you gave that companies are using DQ as OQ, as operation qualification. No, I don't see that. Unfortunately, we don't have a good definition of design qualification. There is no document, not in EU Annex 15, not in the FDA's revised guideline. Unfortunately, even in the FDA's revised guideline of 2011, they no longer use these terminology. You will not find the terminology installation qualification, operation qualification, or design qualification anywhere. So therefore, we have to sort of come up with our own definition, okay? And what is design qualification? And it has nothing to do, well, it doesn't have a direct link to operation qualification. Operation qualification is basically meaning show that it does what it is supposed to do, show that it works the way it's supposed to work based on your functional specs. Here's my definition of design qualification. Design qualification is to do your homework before you go and buy a piece of equipment. Okay?
Before you go into construction.
Yeah, before you even go into construction. So for example, the example I always use is, you come to me, I'm the engineering department, you come to me and you say, I need a new autoclave because the old one is rusting. So I want an autoclave that doesn't rust like the old one did. You know, the old autoclave is too small. You know, I want one that can take 18 baskets, not 9 baskets like the old one. Okay. And I want to use a shorter sterilization cycle. The old one, we could only operate at 121 degrees. I want a higher temperature. Okay. What have you just given me? You have given me a set of user requirements, right? Can I go shopping? Can I call AMSCO and ask them to build me something based on your user requirements? No, I cannot. Because AMSCO will say, what do you mean you want one that doesn't rust? We want specifications. So I, the engineer, need to interpret your user requirements into design specifications and into functional specification. All right, you want an autoclave that does not rust in 5 years. I must order one that's made out of 316 low carbon stainless steel, and it must be electro polish, okay, not mechanical polish. Oh, you want an autoclave that can take 19 baskets or 18 baskets instead of 9 baskets. All right, I better get an autoclave that's 1 meter wide, 1 meter high by 2 meters deep. Okay. All right, now I got my functional specs. I got my design spec. I can go shopping now. All right, where does DQ come in? In my opinion, DQ should come in before you go shopping. Because if you don't do a DQ, you don't sit down with the user again and say, okay, based on your user requirements, here are my design specs. Let's see if my design specifications match or fulfill your user requirement. That's my definition of design qualification, to show that the design conforms to the user requirement. Let's say I don't do it. I go and call the company and they make this for me. I get the autoclave, I come in, and you're the user and you look at this new autoclave and said, God, this thing is deep, it's 2 meters deep. I don't want something that deep, I want it 2 meters wide. And I, the engineer, would say, well, why didn't you tell me? And you would look at me and say, why didn't you ask? Okay? So that's design qualification, unique design qualification. Okay? But to me, the purpose of design qualification is to prevent these things from happening. My definition of design qualification is to show that the design fulfills the user requirement in both physical specifications, okay, design specs, and functional specifications. So using my definition, design qualification has nothing to do with operation qualification. We're nowhere near operation qualification yet at that point.
Good clarification. Because
that's my definition, though.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working with design qualification for some years now, and I think that we have room for improvement here to make the best use of, you know, the initial ambition with the design qualification, to make sure that we get what we actually decided for in our user requirement specification. So we avoid that we generate validation non-compliance issues.
Yes, that's right. Now, there's one thing I always advise my client on, to be careful with design qualification, because since it is a GMP activity, you have to have a protocol, you have to get it reviewed and approved by QA, and then I have to sit down with you and go through each user requirement and document how this design meets each of the user requirements. That's a lot of work, okay? And I have to write a report at the end, and then of course it has to be reviewed by everyone, and everyone signs off on it. Okay, now I go shopping, right? I go shopping, and then I get a call from the vendor that says, you know, we cannot build the cover out of 316L stainless steel. The best we can do is 304. Is that okay with you? Yeah, okay, it won't rust. I'll get 304. What happens to your DQ? Now I got to go back and do the whole thing again, right? Because my design now, I can sit down with the user again and say, okay, does 304, the new design, does that meet your user requirement of not rusting in 5 years? And you know that 2 weeks later, you're going to get another call. And no, we cannot put the gauge here. We could only put the gauge there. No, we cannot make it come up to 135 degrees Celsius. The best we can do is 100. You know what's going to happen, okay? So therefore, my recommendation is that since design qualification is within the scope of the GMP, which means I need a protocol, I need review, I need approval, I need raw data, I need to report and so forth, my recommendation is perform non-formal DQ while you are doing this.
Kind of design review.
Exactly. Just sit down, let's have lunch together, and let's see how this design meets your requirement. And if I get a change, I'm just going to send you an email and say, look, they could only do 304. Do you think it will meet your requirement of this? And that's what I mean by informal. Let's do this informally so that there are no surprises later on. When am I going to do that formal one with the protocol and the raw data? When I get the final design just before delivery. Then I'm going to sit down with you and say, this is the final design. There's no more changes. Now let's document how this final design meets all of your requirements. And again, there should be no surprises if we have been doing this informal one throughout. So that's just a practical recommendation because you don't want to do the formal one from step one, because you will be updating that protocol, you will be filing deviations and filing changes and so forth. So I just want to express the concern about the design. You definitely have to do it, but be careful when you start doing the formal part of it.